Don't watch this documentary alone. This is for your own safety. On the night of March 4th, 1984, an 18-year-old college student named Libby Zion walked into the emergency room of New York Hospital, one of the most respected teaching hospitals in the entire country. She had a fever, an earache, and strange jerking movements she couldn't control. She was awake. She was talking. She was, by every outward measure, a young woman with a bad but survivable illness. 8 hours later, she was dead. What happened inside that hospital during those 8 hours would become one of the most consequential medical cases in American history. Not because of a rare disease or an unknowable mystery, but because of a combination of exhaustion, inexperience, and a drug interaction that nobody caught in time. And it would take her father, a journalist with a lawyer's instincts and a grieving parent's refusal to let go, an entire decade to force the full truth into the open. This is Dark Diagnosis Files, and this is the story of Libby Zion. Let's start with who Libby was. In the spring of 1984, she was a freshman at Bennington College, the daughter of Sidney Zion, a well-connected New York writer who had worked for the New York Times and moved comfortably through the city's media and legal circles. Libby was, by all accounts, bright, spirited, and entirely ordinary in the way that 18-year-olds are. She had her whole life in front of her. In the days before her death, she'd been feeling unwell, a flu-like illness, an earache, a fever that wouldn't quite break. On the evening of March 4th, her condition worsened enough that her parents brought her to the emergency room at New York Hospital. She was examined and admitted by the resident physician on duty that night, with an intern assigned to help manage her care through the overnight hours. And here is where we need to talk about how teaching hospitals actually worked in 1984, because that context is the entire heart of this story. In 1984, the young doctors who staffed hospitals overnight, the interns and residents, physicians still in training, routinely worked shifts that are almost difficult to believe today. 36 hours straight was not unusual. Some worked even longer. They would admit patients, make diagnoses, order medications, and manage life and death decisions while operating on almost no sleep, often with minimal direct supervision from senior attending physicians who were frequently at home and available only by phone. The logic of the system, as its defenders explained it, was that medicine is learned through relentless, immersive exposure. That a doctor who has managed a patient through an entire grueling night learns something a well-rested shift worker never could. Endurance was treated almost as a professional virtue. The exhaustion wasn't seen as a flaw in the system. It was seen as the system. On the night Libby Zion was admitted, the residents responsible for her care had already been awake and working for roughly 18 hours. When Libby arrived, her symptoms were genuinely puzzling. She had a high fever. She was agitated. She had those strange, jerking, uncontrolled movements. The young doctors treating her, working through the exhaustion of an endless shift, diagnosed a viral syndrome with what they described as hysterical symptoms, essentially concluding that her agitation was, in part, an emotional overreaction rather than a purely physical crisis. To manage her agitation, she was given medication. First, to calm her, and then, as she grew more restless, a painkiller called meperidine, known by the brand name Demerol. And this is the moment the case turns, because Libby Zion was already taking another medication, an antidepressant called phenelzine, a drug in a class known as MAO inhibitors. The combination of meperidine and phenelzine is dangerous. In some patients, it can be fatal. Together, these two drugs can trigger a condition now known as serotonin syndrome, a catastrophic reaction in which the body's serotonin levels spike out of control, causing severe agitation, muscle rigidity, and a runaway fever that can climb to lethal extremes. To understand why this is so dangerous, it helps to know what each drug does. Phenelzine, the antidepressant Libby was taking, works by blocking an enzyme that normally breaks down certain brain chemicals, including serotonin. That means anyone taking it already has elevated, carefully balanced levels of these chemicals circulating in their system. Meperidine, the painkiller she was given, independently raises serotonin activity as well. Stack one on top of the other, and that careful balance can collapse into a toxic flood. The brain and body effectively overwhelmed by their own signaling, spiraling into the hypothermia and rigidity that can kill. In 1984, this interaction was not widely known among clinicians. It was documented in the medical literature, but it was obscure, the kind of detail a well-rested specialist might recall, and an exhausted intern, 18 hours into a shift, might never have learned in the first place. There was no computerized alert system to flag the dangerous combination. There was no pharmacist double-checking the order against her existing prescriptions in real time. There was simply a tired young doctor, a distressed patient, and a fatal gap in knowledge. There was also a communication breakdown that would later become central to the case. The intern who was managing Libby overnight did not examine her in person before giving a critical order over the phone. She was juggling the care of dozens of other patients at the same time, paged constantly, stretched impossibly thin. A decision that demanded careful, rested judgment was instead made quickly, remotely, under enormous pressure, by someone who had no realistic capacity to slow down and reconsider. As the night went on, Libby became more agitated, not less. At one point she was placed in physical restraints to keep her still. Her temperature began to climb, and climb. By the time anyone fully grasped the severity of what was happening, her fever had reached a staggering 107 degrees Fahrenheit. She went into cardiac arrest. Efforts to save her failed. Roughly 8 hours after walking into the emergency room, Libby Zion was dead. The initial autopsy listed her cause of death as pneumonia. For most families, in most cases, that might have been the end of it. A devastating, unexplained tragedy, quietly absorbed into private grief. But Libby's father, Sidney Zion, was not going to accept a vague answer. He was a journalist and a former attorney, and something about the story he was being told did not add up. How does a healthy 18-year-old walk into one of the best hospitals in the country and die within hours? He wanted to know exactly what had happened in that room, and he had the skills, the connections, and the sheer relentless determination to find out. What he uncovered horrified him. He learned that his daughter had been given a drug that could fatally interact with her existing medication. He learned that she had been placed in restraints, and he learned that the doctors making these decisions had been operating on almost no sleep, with an attending physician who never physically came to see her that night. In a now famous line, Sidney wrote in a New York Times op-ed, "You don't need kindergarten to know that a resident working a 36-hour shift is in no condition to make any kind of judgment call. Forget about life and death." Sidney Zion fought his daughter's case on two fronts at once, and he fought both for nearly a decade. The first front was criminal. He pushed the Manhattan District Attorney to convene a grand jury and consider criminal charges against the doctors involved. In 1986, that grand jury met. It ultimately declined to indict any of the physicians criminally, but it did something arguably more significant. Rather than charging individuals, the grand jury issued a report that indicted the entire system. It concluded that the real problem was a medical training structure that allowed overtired, inadequately supervised young doctors to make critical decisions about seriously ill patients. The second front was civil. Sidney Zion filed a malpractice lawsuit against the hospital and the treating physicians. That case took 10 years to reach trial, an extraordinarily long journey even by the standards of New York's crowded courts. When it finally concluded in 1995, a jury reached a genuinely complicated verdict. It found that the doctors had contributed to Libby's death, including by prescribing the wrong drug, and awarded the family damages for her pain and suffering. But the lasting legacy of the Libby Zion case was never really about the verdict, or the money, or even the individual doctors. It was about what happened to medicine itself in the years after her death. In response to the grand jury's findings, the New York State Health Department convened a special committee, the Bell Commission, named after the physician who led it, Dr. Bertram Bell. The commission was tasked with investigating resident work hours and supervision and proposing concrete reforms. What the Bell Commission recommended was, at the time, genuinely radical. It proposed that resident physicians should work no more than 80 hours per week. It proposed that they should not work more than 24 consecutive hours at a stretch. It proposed mandatory rest between shifts. And, critically, it demanded significantly increased supervision of junior doctors by experienced attending physicians, especially during those dangerous overnight hours. These recommendations became New York state law in 1989, codified in the regulations that would forever after be known simply as the Libby Zion Law. For the first time, there was a legal ceiling on how long a doctor in training could be kept awake and working while responsible for human lives. And it didn't stop at New York's borders. The debate Libby's death ignited spread across the entire country. In 2003, nearly 2 decades after that night in the emergency room, the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education adopted similar work-hour limits as a national standard, binding on every accredited teaching hospital in the United States. An intern in California, a resident in Texas, a young doctor in Florida, All of them now worked under rules that traced directly back to what happened to one 18-year-old in a New York hospital in 1984. The pressure for national reform was accelerated by two developments beyond the case itself. A national labor board ruling around the same period began treating medical trainees as genuine employees of their hospitals, rather than merely students, opening the door to the possibility that the federal government might step in to regulate their working conditions directly. Faced with the prospect of external regulation, the medical profession moved to police itself first, adopting the duty hour limits partly to keep control of its own training standards. In other words, a reform that began with one grieving father's crusade was ultimately cemented by the profession's own recognition that if it didn't act, someone else would. Now, in the spirit of honesty that this channel is built on, it's important to say that the Libby Zion case remains genuinely debated among medical professionals to this day, and not everyone agrees on its lessons. Some physicians have argued that the case became a media-driven crusade that oversimplified a complicated death. They point out that the exact cause of Libby's death was never established with total certainty, that questions about her own undisclosed medications and history clouded the picture, and that the focus on resident fatigue may have distracted from an even more fundamental issue, that inexperienced doctors, tired or not, were being asked to make complex diagnoses they simply weren't yet equipped to make. Was the real problem exhaustion? Or was it a lack of supervision? A young intern who hadn't yet learned to tell truly sick from not sick, left without a senior physician to catch the mistake. Others have raised uncomfortable questions about whether the reforms even achieved their goal. In the decades since work hours were capped, some studies have struggled to find clear evidence that patient deaths actually decreased as a result. Reducing hours created new problems of its own, more frequent handoffs between doctors, where critical information about a patient can get lost in the shuffle from one tired team to the next. The honest truth is that a good reform can be born from a case that was never fully resolved. Both of those things can be true at once. What isn't debated is the human core of it. An 18-year-old walked into a hospital expecting to be helped, and the system that was supposed to protect her failed her. Through exhaustion, through inexperience, through a dangerous gap between two medications that no one caught in time. Her father transformed his grief into a decade-long fight that reshaped how medicine is practiced for millions of patients who will never know her name. The next time you're treated by a doctor who isn't in their 36th straight hour of work, who has had at least some enforced limit on how long they can be kept awake while holding your life in their hands, that protection exists, in part, because of what happened to Libby Zion. Before we close, if this story affected you the way these cases affect us while we research them, take a moment to subscribe to Dark Diagnosis Files. Every episode we investigate is a real documented case, the ones medicine would sometimes rather forget, and the ones that changed it forever. Your subscription is what keeps this channel investigating them. This has been a real documented case in medical history. Every detail in this video is sourced from confirmed court records, grand jury findings, and published medical literature. Dark Diagnosis Files investigates the horror that happens around hospitals and medicine. New cases every Sunday, Tuesday, and Friday. Real, documented, told with the gravity they deserve. Libby Zion was 18 years old. Every doctor who has ever been sent home to sleep instead of working a second straight day owes something to a night none of them can remember, and one family has never been able to forget.